The Cybrarian Presents Robert E. Howard's Solomon Kane. Wings in the Night. Images courtesy of unsplash.com. Audio samples courtesy of YouTube Audio Library. Disclaimer. The following may contain violence, references to sex, and language that may offend. Chapter 1. The Horror on the Stake. Solomon Kane leaned on his strangely carved staff and gazed in scowling perplexity at the mystery which spread silently before him. Many a deserted village Kane had seen in the months that had passed since he turned his face east from the slave coast and lost himself in the mazes of jungle and river. But never one like this. It was not famine that had driven away the inhabitants, for yonder the wild rice still grew rank and unkempt in the untilled fields. There were no Arab slave raiders in this nameless land. It must have been a tribal war that devastated the village, Kane decided, as he gazed somberly at the scattered bones and grinning skulls that littered the space among the rank weeds and grasses. These bones were shattered and splintered, and Kane saw jackals and hyena furtively slinking among the ruined huts. But why had the slayers left the spoils? There lay war spears, their shafts crumbling before the attacks of the white ants. There lay shields, mouldering in the rains and sun. There lay the cooking pots, and about the neck bones of a shattered skeleton glittered a necklace of gaudily painted pebbles and shells. Surely rare loot for any savage conqueror. He gazed at the huts, wondering why the thatched roofs of so many were torn and rent, as if by taloned things seeking entrance. Then something made his cold eyes narrow in startled unbelief. Just outside the mouldering mound that was once the village wall towered a gigantic baobab tree, branchless for 60 feet. Its mighty bole too large to be gripped and scaled, yet in the topmost branches dangled a skeleton, apparently impaled on a broken limb. The cold hand of mystery touched the shoulder of Solomon Kane. How came those pitiful remains in that tree? Had some monstrous ogre's inhuman hand flung them there? Kane shrugged his broad shoulders, and his hand unconsciously touched the black butts of his heavy pistols, the hilt of his long rapier, and the dirk in his belt. Kane felt no fear, as an ordinary man would feel, confronted with the unknown and nameless. Years of wandering in strange lands and warring with strange creatures had melted away from brain, soul, and body all that was not steel and whalebone. He was tall and spare, almost gaunt, built with the savage economy of the wolf. Broad-shouldered, long-armed, with nerves of ice and thews of spring steel, he was no less the natural killer than the born swordsman. The brambles and thorns of the jungle had dealt hardly with him. His garments hung in tatters. His featherless slouch hat was torn and his boots of Cordovan leather were scratched and worn. The sun had baked his chest and limbs to a deep bronze. But his aesthetically lean face was impervious to its rays. His complexion was still of that strange dark pallor which gave him an almost corpse-like appearance, belied only by his cold, light eyes. And now Kane, sweeping the village once more with his searching gaze, pulled his belt into a more comfortable position, shifted to his left hand the cat-headed stave Nolonga had given him, and took up his way again. To the west lay a strip of thin forest, sloping downwards to a broad belt of savannas, a waving sea of grass waist deep and deeper. Beyond that rose another narrow strip of woodlands, deepening rapidly into dense jungle. Out of that jungle, Kane had fled like a hunted wolf, with pointed-toothed men hot on his trail. Even now, a vagrant breeze brought faintly the throb of a savage drum, which whispered its obscene tale of hate and blood hunger and belly lust across miles of jungle and grassland. The memory of his flight and narrow escape was vivid in Kane's mind, for only the day before had he realized too late that he was in cannibal country, and all that afternoon in the reeking stench of the thick jungle he had crept and run and hidden and doubled and twisted on his track, with the fierce hunters ever close behind him, until night fell and he gained and crossed the grasslands under cover of darkness. Now in the late morning, he had seen nothing, heard nothing of his pursuers. Yet he had no reason to believe that they had abandoned the chase. They had been close on his heels when he took to the savannas. So Kane surveyed the land in front of him. To the east, curving from north to south, ran a straggling range of hills, for the most part dry and barren, rising in the south to a jagged black skyline that reminded Kane of the Black Hills of Nagari. Between him and these hills stretched a broad expanse of gently rolling country, thickly treed, but nowhere approaching the density of a jungle. Kane got the impression of a vast upland plateau, bounded by the curving hills to the east and by the savannas to the west. Kane set out for the hills, with his long, swinging, tireless stride. Surely somewhere behind him, the savage demons were stealing after him, and he had no desire to be driven to bay. A shot might send them flying in sudden terror, but on the other hand, so low they were in scale of humanity, it might transmit no supernatural fear to their dull brains. And not even Solomon Kane, whom Sir Francis Drake had called Devon's King of Swords, could win in a pitched battle with a whole tribe. The silent village, with its burden of death and mystery, faded out behind him. Utter silence reigned among these mysterious uplands, where no birds sang and only a silent macaw flitted among the great trees. The only sounds were Kane's cat-like tread and the whisper of the drum-haunted breeze. And then Kane caught a glimpse among the trees that made his heart leap with a sudden, nameless horror. And a few moments later he stood before horror itself, stark and grisly. In a wide clearing, on a rather bold incline, stood a grim stake, and to this stake was bound a thing that had once been a man. Kane had rowed, chained to the bench of a Turkish galley, and he had toiled in Barbary vineyards. He had battled Red Indians in the New Lands, and had languished in the dungeon of Spain's Inquisition. He knew much of the fiendishness of man's inhumanity, but now he shuddered and grew sick. Yet it was not so much the ghastliness of the mutilations, horrible as they were, that shook Kane's soul, but the knowledge that the wretch still lived. For as he drew nearer, the gory head that lolled on the butchered breast lifted and tossed from side to side, spattering blood from the stumps of ears, while a bestial, rattling whimper drooled from the shredded lips. Kane spoke to the ghastly thing, and it screamed unbearably, writhing in incredible contortions. While its head jerked up and down with the jerking of mangled nerves, and the empty, gaping eye sockets seemed striving to see from their emptiness. And moaning low and brain-shatteringly, it huddled its outraged self against the stake where it was bound, and lifted its head in a grisly attitude of listening, as if it expected something out of the skies. "Listen," said Kane, in the dialect of the river tribes. "Do not fear me. I will not harm you, and nothing else shall harm you any more. I am going to loose you." Even as he spoke, Kane was bitterly aware of the emptiness of his words, but his voice had filtered dimly into the crumbling, agony-shot brain of the man before him. From between splintered teeth fell words, faltering and uncertain, mixed and mingled with the slavering droolings of imbecility. He spoke a language akin to the dialects Kane had learned from the friendly river folk on his wanderings. And Kane gathered that he had been bound to the stake for a long time, many moons. He whimpered in the delirium of approaching death, and all this time, inhuman, evil things had worked their monstrous will upon him. These things he mentioned by name, but Kane could make nothing of it, for he used an unfamiliar term that sounded like Aakash. But these things had not bound him to the stake, for the torn wretch slavered the name of Goru, who was a priest, and who had drawn a cord too tight about his legs. And Kane wondered that the memory of the small pain should linger through the red mazes of agony, that the dying man should whimper over it. And to Kane's horror, the man spoke of his brother, who had aided in the binding of him, and he wept with infantile sobs. Moisture formed in the empty sockets and made tears of blood, and he muttered of a spear broken long ago in some dim hut. And while he muttered in his delirium, Kane gently cut his bonds and eased his broken body to the grass. But even at the Englishman's careful touch, the poor wretch writhed and howled like a dying dog, while blood started anew from a score of ghastly gashes, which, Kane noted, were more like the wounds made by fang and talon than by knife or spear. But at last it was done, and the bloody, torn thing lay on the soft grass, with Kane's old slouch hat beneath his death's head, breathing in great, rattling gasps. Kane poured water from his canteen between the mangled lips, and bending close said, "Tell me more of these devils, for by the God of my people, this deed shall not go unavenged, though Satan himself bar my way." It is doubtful if the dying man heard, but he heard something else. The macaw, with the curiosity of its breed, swept from a nearby grove and passed so close its great wings fanned Kane's hair. And at the sound of those wings, the butchered man heaved upright and screamed in a voice that haunted Kane's dreams to the day of his death. The wings, they come again. Mercy, the wings. And the blood burst in a torrent from his lips, and so he died. Kane rose and wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. The upland forest shimmered in the noonday heat. Silence lay over the land like an enchantment of dreams. Kane's brooding eyes ranged to the black, malevolent hills, crouching in the distance and back to the faraway savannas. An ancient curse lay over that mysterious land, and the shadow of it fell across the soul of Solomon Kane. Tenderly, he lifted the red ruin that had once pulsed with life and youth and vitality, and carried it to the edge of the glade, where, arranging the cold limbs as best he might, and shuddering once again at the unnameable mutilations, he piled stones above it, till even a prowling jackal would find it hard to get at the flesh below. And he had scarcely finished when something jerked him back out of his sombre brooding to a realization of his own position. A slight sound, or his own wolf-like instinct, made him whirl. On the other side of the glade he caught a movement among the tall grasses. The glimpse of a hideous face, with an ivory ring in the flat nose, thick lips parted to reveal teeth whose filed points were apparent even at that distance, beady eyes and a low, slanting forehead topped by a mop of frizzly hair. Even as the face faded from view, Kane leapt back into the shelter of the ring of trees, which circled the glade, and ran like a deerhound, flitting from tree to tree and expecting at each moment to hear the exultant clamour of the warriors, to see them break cover at his back. But soon he decided that they were content to hunt him down, as certain beasts track their prey, slowly and inevitably. He hastened through the upland forest, taking advantage of every bit of cover, and he saw no more of his pursuers. Yet he knew, as a hunted wolf knows, that they hovered close behind him, waiting their moment to strike him down without risk to their own hides. Kane smiled bleakly, and without mirth. If it was to be a test of endurance, he would see how savage thews compared to his own spring-steel resilience. Let night come, and he might yet give them the slip. If not, Kane knew in his heart that the savage essence of his very being, which chafed at his flight, would make him soon turn at bay, though his pursuers outnumbered him 100 to 1. The sun sank westward. Kane was hungry, for he had not eaten since early morning when he wolfed down the last of his dried meat. An occasional spring had given him water, and once he had thought he glimpsed the roof of a large hut far away through the trees, but he gave it a wide berth. It was hard to believe that this silent plateau was inhabited, but if it were, the natives were doubtless as ferocious as those hunting him. Ahead of him the land grew rougher, with broken boulders and steep slopes as he neared the lower reaches of the brooding hills, and still no sight of his hunters except for faint glimpses caught by wary backward glances. A drifting shadow, the bending of the grass, the sudden straightening of a trodden twig, a rustle of leaves. Why should they be so cautious? Why did they not close in and have it over? Night fell, and Kane reached the first long slopes which led upward to the foot of the hills, which now brooded black and menacing above him. They were his goal, where he hoped to shake off his persistent foes at last. Yet a nameless aversion warned him away from them. They were pregnant with hidden evil, repellent as the coil of a great sleeping serpent, glimpsed in the tall grass. Darkness fell heavily. The stars winked redly in the thick heat of the tropic night, and Kane, halting for a moment in an unusually dense grove, beyond which the trees thinned out on the slopes, heard a stealthy movement that was not the night wind. For no breath of air stirred the heavy leaves, and even as he turned, there was a rush in the dark under the trees. A shadow that merged with the shadows flung itself on Kane with a bestial mouthing and a rattle of iron. And the Englishman, parrying by the gleam of the stars on the weapon, felt his assailant duck into close quarters and met him chest to chest. Lean, wiry arms locked about him, pointed teeth gnashed at him as Kane returned the fierce grapple. His tattered shirt ripped beneath a jagged edge, and by blind chance Kane found and pinioned the hand that held the iron knife, and drew his own dirk, flesh crawling in anticipation of a spear in the back. But even as the Englishman wondered why the others did not come to their comrade's aid, he threw all of his iron muscles into the single combat. Close clinched, they swayed and writhed in the darkness, each striving to drive his blade into the other's flesh. And as the superior strength of the Puritan began to assert itself, the cannibal howled like a rabid dog, tore and bit. A convulsive spin wheel of effort pivoted them out into the starlit glade, where Kane saw the ivory nose ring and the pointed teeth that had snapped beast-like at his throat. And simultaneously, he forced back and down the hand that gripped his knife wrist and drove the dirk deep into the savage wrists. The warrior screamed, and the raw, acrid scent of blood flooded the night air. And in that instant, Kane was stunned by a savage rush and beat of mighty wings that dashed him to the earth. And the cannibal was torn from his grip and vanished with a scream of mortal agony. Kane leapt to his feet, shaken to his foundation. The dwindling scream of the wretched savage sounded faintly and from above him. Straining his eyes into the skies, he thought he caught a glimpse of a shapeless and horrific thing crossing the dim stars, in which the writhing limbs of a human mingled namelessly with great wings and a shadowy shape. But so quickly it was gone, he could not be sure. And now he wondered if it were not all a nightmare. But groping in the grove, he found the juju stave, with which he had parried the short, stabbing spear that lay beside it. And here, if more proof was needed, was his long dirk, still stained with blood. Wings. Wings in the night. The skeleton in the village of torn roofs. The mutilated warrior whose wounds were not made with knife or spear, and who died shrieking of wings. Surely those hills were the haunt of gigantic birds who made humanity their prey. Yet if birds, why had they not wholly devoured the torn man on the stake? And Kane knew in his heart that no true bird ever cast such a shadow as he had seen flit across the stars. He shrugged his shoulders, bewildered. The night was silent. Where were the rest of the cannibals who had followed him from the distant jungle? Had the fate of their comrade frightened them into flight? Kane looked to his pistols. Cannibals or no, he went not up into those dark hills that night. Now he must sleep, if all the devils of the elder world were on his track. A deep roaring to the westward warned him that beasts of prey were aroam. And he walked rapidly down the rolling slopes until he came to a dense grove, some distance from that in which he had fought the cannibal. He climbed high among the great branches until he found a thick crotch that would accommodate even his tall frame. The branches above would guard him from a sudden swoop of any winged thing, and if savages were lurking near, their clamber into the tree would warn him, for he slept lightly as a cat. As for serpents and leopards, they were chances he had taken 1,000 times. Solomon Kane slept, and his dreams were vague, chaotic, haunted with a suggestion of pre-human evil, and which at last merged into a vision, vivid as a scene in waking life. Solomon dreamed he woke with a start, drawing a pistol, for so long had his life been that of a wolf, that reaching for a weapon was his natural reaction upon waking suddenly. His dream was that a strange, shadowy thing had perched upon a great branch close by and gazed at him with greedy, luminous yellow eyes that seared into his brain. The dream thing was tall and lean and strangely misshapen, so blended with the shadows that it seemed a shadow itself, tangible only in the narrow yellow eyes. And Kane dreamed he waited, spellbound, while uncertainty came into those eyes. And then the creature walked out on the limb as a man would walk, raised great shadowy wings, sprang into space, and vanished. Kane jerked upright, the mists of sleep fading. In the dim starlight, under the arching Gothic-like branches, the tree was empty, save for himself. Then it had been a dream, after all. Yet it had been so vivid, so fraught with inhuman foulness. Even now, a faint scent like that exuded by birds of prey seemed to linger in the air. Kane strained his ears. He heard the sighing of the night wind, the whisper of the leaves, the faraway roaring of a lion, but naught else. Again Solomon slept, while high above him a shadow wheeled against the stars, circling again and again as a vulture circles a dying wolf. Chapter 2. The Battle in the Sky. Dawn was spreading whitely over the eastern hills when Kane woke. The thought of his nightmare came to him, and he wondered again at its vividness as he climbed down out of the tree. A nearby spring slaked his thirst, and some fruit, rare in these highlands, eased his hunger. Then he turned his face again to the hills. A Finnish fighter was Solomon Kane. Along that grim skyline dwelt some evil foe to the sons of men. And that mere fact was as much a challenge to the Puritan as had ever been a glove thrown in his face by some hot-headed gallant of Devon. Refreshed by his night's sleep, he set out with his long, easy stride, passing the grove that had witnessed the battle in the night, and coming into the region where the trees thinned at the foot of the slopes. Up these slopes he went, halting for a moment to gaze back over the way he had come. Now that he was above the plateau, he could easily make out a village in the distance, a cluster of mud and bamboo huts, with one unusually large hut a short distance from the rest, on a sort of low knoll. And while he gazed, with a sudden rush of grisly wings the terror was upon him. Kane whirled, galvanized. All signs had pointed to the theory of a winged thing that hunted by night. He had not expected attack in broad daylight. But here, a bat-like monster was swooping at him, out of the very eye of the rising sun. Kane saw a spread of mighty wings from which glared a horribly human face. Then he drew and fired with unerring aim, and the monster veered wildly in midair and came whirling and tumbling out of the sky to crash at his feet. Kane leaned forward, pistol smoking in his hand, and gazed wide-eyed. Surely this thing was a demon out of the pits of hell, said the sombre mind of the Puritan. Yet a leaden ball had slain it. Kane shrugged his shoulders, baffled. He had never seen aught to approach this, though all his life had fallen in strange ways. The thing was like a man, inhumanly tall and inhumanly thin. The head was long, narrow, and hairless, the head of a predatory creature. The ears were small, close-set and queerly pointed. The eyes, set in death, were narrow, oblique and of a strange yellowish colour. The nose was thin and hooked, like the beak of a bird of prey. The mouth a wide, cruel gash, whose thin lips, writhed in a death snarl and flecked with foam, disclosed wolfish fangs. The creature, which was naked and hairless, was not unlike a human being in other ways. The shoulders were broad and powerful, the neck long and lean. The arms were long and muscular, the thumb being set beside the fingers after the manner of the great apes. Fingers and thumbs were armed with heavy, hooked talons. The chest was curiously misshapen, the breastbone jutting out like the keel of a ship, the ribs carving back from it. The legs were long and wiry, with huge, hand-like prehensile feet, the great toe set opposite the rest like a man's thumb. The claws on the toes were merely long nails. But the most curious feature of this curious creature was on its back. A pair of great wings, shaped much like the wings of a moth, but with a bony frame and of leathery substance, grew from the shoulders, beginning at a point just back and above where the arms joined the shoulders, and extending halfway to the narrow hips. These wings, Kane reckoned, would measure some 18 feet from tip to tip. He laid hold on the creature, involuntarily shuddering at the slick, hard, leather-like feel of the skin, and half lifted it. The weight was little more than half as much as it would have been in a man of the same height, some 6.5 feet. Evidently, the bones were of a peculiar bird-like structure, and the flesh consisted almost entirely of stringy muscles. Kane stepped back, surveying the thing again. Then his dream had been no dream after all. That full thing, or another like it, had, in grisly reality, lighted in the tree beside him. A whir of mighty wings. A sudden rush through the sky. Even as Kane whirled, he realized he had committed the jungle farer's unpardonable crime. He had allowed his astonishment and curiosity to throw him off guard. Already, a winged fiend was at his throat, and there was no time to draw and fire his other pistol. Kane saw, in a maze of thrashing wings, a devilish, semi-human face. He felt those wings battering at him. He felt cruel talons sink deep into his breast. Then he was dragged off his feet and felt empty space beneath him. The winged man had wrapped his limbs about the Englishman's legs, and the talons he had driven into Kane's breast muscles held like fanged vices. The wolf-like fangs drove at Kane's throat, but the Puritan gripped the bony throat and thrust back the grisly head, while with his right hand he strove to draw his dirk. The birdman was mounting slowly, and a fleeting glance showed Kane that they were already high above the trees. The Englishman did not hope to survive the battle in the sky, for even if he slew his foe, he would be dashed to death in the fall. But with the innate ferocity of the fighting man, he set himself grimly to take his captor with him. Holding those keen fangs at bay, Kane managed to draw his dirk, and he plunged it deep into the body of the monster. The Bat-Man veered wildly, and a rasping, raucous screech burst from his half-throttled throat. He floundered wildly, beating frantically with his great wings, bowing his back and twisting his head fiercely in a vain effort to free it and sink home his deadly fangs. He sank the talons of one hand agonizingly deeper and deeper into Kane's breast muscles, while with the other he tore at his foe's head and body. But the Englishman, gashing and bleeding, with the silent and tenacious savagery of a bulldog, sank his fingers deeper into the lean neck and drove his dirk home again and again, while far below awed eyes watched the fiendish battle that was raging at that dizzy height. They had drifted out over the plateau, and the fast weakening wings of the Bat-Man barely supported their weight. They were sinking earthward, swiftly, but Kane, blinded with blood and battle fury, knew nothing of this. With a great piece of his scalp hanging loose, his chest and shoulders cut and ripped, the world had become a blind, red thing in which he was aware of but one sensation: the bulldog urge to to kill his foe. Now the feeble and spasmodic beating of the dying monster's wings held them hovering for an instant above a thick grove of gigantic trees, while Kane felt the grip of the claws and twining limbs grow weaker and the slashing of the talons become a futile flailing. With a last burst of power, he drove the reddened dirk straight through the breastbone and felt a convulsive tremor run through the creature's frame. The great wings fell limp, and victor and vanquish dropped headlong and plummet-like earthward. Through a red wave, Kane saw the waving branches rushing up to meet them. He felt them flail his face and tear at his clothing, as still locked in that death clinch he rushed downward through the leaves which eluded his vainly grasping hand. Then his head crashed against a great limb, and an endless abyss of blackness engulfed him. Chapter 3. The People in the Shadow. Through colossal, black, basaltic corridors of night, Solomon Kane fled for 1,000 years. Gigantic winged demons, horrific in the utter darkness, swept over him with a rush of great bat-like pinions, and in the blackness he fought with them, as a cornered rat fights a vampire bat, while fleshless jaws drooled fearful blasphemies and horrid secrets in his ears, and the skulls of men rolled under his groping feet. Solomon Kane came back suddenly from the land of delirium, and his first sight of sanity was that of a fat, kindly native face bending over him. Kane saw he was in a roomy, clean and well-ventilated hut, while from a cooking pot bubbling outside wafted savoury scents. Kane realised he was ravenously hungry, and he was strangely weak. The hand he lifted to his bandaged head shook, and its bronze was dimmed. The fat man and another, a tall, gaunt, grim-faced warrior, bent over him, and the fat man said, "He is awake, Kuroba, and of sound mind." The gaunt man nodded and called something which was answered from without. "What is this place?" asked Kane, in a language he had learned that was similar to the dialect just used. "How long have I lain here?" "This is the last village of Bagonda." The fat man pressed him back, with hands as gentle as a woman's. "We found you, lying beneath the trees on the slopes, badly wounded and senseless. You have raved in delirium for many days. Now eat, eat." A lithe young warrior entered with a wooden bowl full of steaming food, and Kane ate ravenously. "He is like a leopard, Kuroba," said the fat man admiringly. "Not one in 1,000 would have lived with his wounds." "Aye," returned the other. "And he slew the Akana that rent him, Goru." Kane struggled to his elbows. "Goru," he cried fiercely, "the priest who binds men as stakes for devils to eat." And he strove to rise so that he could strangle the fat man. But his weakness swept over him like a wave. The hut swam dizzily to his eyes, and he sank back, panting, where he soon fell into a sound, natural sleep. Later he awoke and found a slim young girl named Nayela watching him. She fed him, and feeling much stronger, Kane asked questions, which she answered shyly but intelligently. This was Bagonda, ruled by Kuroba, the chief, and Goru, his priest. None in Bagonda had ever seen or heard of a white man before. She counted the days Kane had lain helpless, and he was amazed. But such a battle as he had been through was enough to kill an ordinary man. He wondered that no bones had been broken, but the girl said the branches had broken his fall and he had landed on the body of the Akana. He asked for Goru, and the fat priest came to him, bringing Kane's weapons. "Some we found with you, where you lay," said Goru. "Some by the body of the Akana you slew with the weapon, which speaks in fire and smoke. You must be a god, yet the gods bleed not. And you have just all but died. Who are you?" "I am no god," Kane answered, "but a man like yourself. I come from a far land, amid the sea, which land, mind ye, is the fairest and noblest of all lands. My name is Solomon Kane, and I am a landless wanderer. From the lips of a dying man I first heard your name. Yet your face seemeth kindly." A shadow crossed the eyes of the shaman, and he hung his head. "Rest no. Rest and grow strong. Oh man, or God, or whatever you be," he said. "And in time you will learn of the ancient curse that rests upon this ancient land." And in the days that followed, while Kane recovered and grew strong with the wild beast vitality that was his, Goru and Kuroba sat and spoke to him at length, telling him many curious things. Their tribe was not aboriginal here, but had come upon the plateau 150 years before, giving it the name of their former home. They had once been a powerful tribe in Old Bagonda, on a great river far to the south. But tribal wars broke their power, and at last, before a concerted uprising, the whole tribe gave way, and Goru repeated legends of that great flight of 1,000 miles through jungle and swampland, harried at every step by cruel foes. At last, hacking their way through a country of ferocious cannibals, they found themselves safe from man's attack, but prisoners in a trap, from which neither they nor their descendants could ever escape. They were in the horror country of Akana, and Goru said his ancestors came to understand the jeering laughter of the man-eaters, who had hounded them to the very borders of the plateau. The Burgundy found a fertile country with good water and plenty of game. There were numbers of goats and a species of wild pig that throve here in great abundance. At first the people ate these pigs, but later they spared them for a good reason. The grasslands between plateau and jungle swarmed with antelopes, buffaloes and the like, and there were many lions. Lions also roamed the plateau, but Bagonda meant lion slayer in their tongue, and it was not many moons before the remnants of the great cats took to the lower levels. But it was not lions they had to fear, as Goru's ancestors soon learned. Finding that the cannibals would not come past the savannas, they rested from their long trek and built 2 villages, Upper and Lower Bagonda. Kane was in Upper Bagonda. He had seen the ruins of the lower village. But soon they found that they had strayed into a country of nightmares with dripping fangs and talons. They heard the beat of mighty wings at night and saw horrific shadows cross the stars and loom against the moon. Children began to disappear, and at last a young hunter strayed off into the hills where night overtook him. And in the grey light of dawn, a mangled, half-devoured corpse fell from the skies into the village street, and a whisper of ogreish laughter from high above froze the horrified onlookers. Then a little later, the full horror of their position burst upon the Burgundy. At first the winged men were afraid of the newcomers. They hid themselves and ventured from their caravans only at night. Then they grew bolder. In the full daylight, a warrior shot one with an arrow, but the fiends had learned they could slay a human, and its death screams brought a score of the devils dropping from the skies, who tore the slayer to pieces in full sight of the tribe. The Burgundy then prepared to leave that devil's country, and 100 warriors went up into the hills to find a pass. They found steep walls, up which a man must climb laboriously. And they found the cliffs, honeycombed with caves where the winged men dwelt. Then was fought the first pitched battle between men and batmen, and it resulted in a crushing victory for the monsters. The bows and spears of the natives proved futile before the swoops of the taloned fiends, and of all that 100 that went up into the hills, not one survived. For the Aakash hunted down those that fled, and dragged down the last one within bowshot of the upper village. Then it was that the Burgundy, seeing they could not hope to win through the hills, sought to fight their way out again the way they had come. But a great horde of cannibals met them in the grasslands, and in a great battle that lasted nearly all day, hurled them back, broken and defeated. And Goru said, while the battle raged, the skies were thronged with hideous shapes, circling above and laughing their fearful mirth to see men die wholesale. So the survivors of those two battles, licking their wounds, bowed to the inevitable with the fantastic philosophy of the savage. Some 1,500 men, women and children remained, and they built their huts, tilled the soil and lived stolidly in the shadow of the nightmare. In those days there were many of the bird people, and they might have wiped out the Burgundy utterly had they wished. No one warrior could cope with an Aakash, for he was stronger than a human. He struck as a hawk strikes, and if he missed, his wings carried him out of reach of a counterblow. Here Kane interrupted to ask why the Burgundy did not make war on the demons with arrows. But Goru answered that it took a quick and accurate archer to strike an Aakash in midair at all, and so tough were their hides that unless the arrow struck squarely, it would not penetrate. Kane knew that the natives were very indifferent bowmen, and that they pointed their shafts with chipped stone, bone, or hammered iron, almost as soft as copper. He thought of pointiers and agincourt, and wished grimly for a file of stout English archers, or a rank of musketeers. But Goru said the Aakash did not seem to wish to destroy the Burgundy utterly. Their chief food consisted of the little pigs, which then swarmed the plateau, and young goats. Sometimes they went out on the savannas for antelope, but they distrusted the open country and feared the lions. Nor did they haunt the jungles beyond, for the trees grew too close for the spread of their wings. They kept to the hills and the plateau, and what lay beyond those hills none in Burgundy knew. The Aakash allowed the Burgundy to inhabit the plateau, much as men allow wild animals to thrive, or stock lakes with fish for their own pleasure. The Bat people, said Goru, had a strange and grisly sense of humour, which was tickled by the sufferings of a howling human. Those grim hills had echoed to cries that turned men's hearts to ice. But for many years, Goru said, once the Burgundy learned not to resist their masters, the Aakash were content to snatch up a baby from time to time, or devour a young girl strayed from the village, or a youth whom night caught outside the walls. The Bat folk distrusted the village. They circled high above it, but did not venture within. There the Burgundy were safe until late years. Goru said that the Aakash were fast dying out. Once there had been hope that the remnants of his race would outlast them, in which event, he said fatalistically, the cannibals would undoubtedly come up from the jungle and put the survivors in their cooking pots. Now he doubted if there were more than 150 Aakash altogether. Kane asked him, why did not the warriors then sally forth on a great hunt and destroy the devils utterly? And Goru smiled a bitter smile and repeated his remarks about the prowess of the Bat people in battle. Moreover, he said, the whole tribe of Burgundy numbered only about 400 souls now, and the Bat people were their only protection against the cannibals to the west. Goru said the tribe had thinned more in the past 30 years than in all the years previous. As the numbers of Aakash dwindled, their hellish savagery increased. They seized more and more of the Burgundy to torture and devour in their grim black caves high up in the hills. And Goru spoke of sudden raids on hunting parties and toilers in the plantain fields, and of the nights made ghastly by horrible screams and gibberings from the dark hills, and blood-freezing laughter that was half human, of dismembered limbs and gory, grinning heads flung from the skies to fall in the shuddering village, and of grisly feasts among the stars. Then came drought, Goru said, and a great famine. Many of the springs dried up, and the crops of rice and yams and plantains failed. The gnus, deer and buffaloes, which had formed the main part of Burgundy's meat diet, withdrew to the jungle in quest of water, and the lions, their hunger overcoming their fear of man, ranged into the uplands. Many of the tribe died, and the rest were driven by hunger to eat the pigs, which were the natural prey of the Bat people. This angered the Aakash and thinned the pigs. Famine, Burgundy, and the lions destroyed all the goats and half the pigs. At last the famine was past, but the damage was done. Of all the great droves which once swarmed the plateau, only a remnant was left, and these were hard to catch. The Burgundy had eaten the pigs, so the Aakash ate the Burgundy. Life became a hell for the humans and the lower village, numbering now only some 150 souls, rose in revolt. Driven to frenzy by repeated outrages, they turned on their masters. An Aakash, lighting in the very street to steal a child, was set on and shot to death with arrows, and the people of Lower Burgundy drew into their huts and waited for their doom. And in the night, said Goru, it came. The Aakash had overcome their distrust of the huts. The full flock of them swarmed down from the hills, and Upper Burgundy awoke to hear the fearful cataclysm of screams and blasphemies that marked the end of the other village. All night, Goru's people had lain sweating in terror, not daring to move, hearkening to the howling and gibbering that rent the night. At least these sounds ceased, said Goru, wiping the cold sweat from his brow. But sounds of grisly and obscene feasting still haunted the night with demons' mockery. In early dawn, Goru's people saw the hell flock winging back to their hills, like demons flying back to hell through the dawn. They flew slowly and heavily, like gorged vultures. Later the people dared to steal down to the accursed village, and what they found there sent them shrinking away. And to that day, Goru said, no man passed within 3 bowshots of that silent horror. And Kane nodded in understanding, his cold eyes more somber than ever. For many days after that, Goru said the people waited in quaking fear. Finally, in desperation of fear, which breeds unspeakable cruelty, the tribe cast lots, and the loser was bound to a stake between the 2 villages, in hopes that the Aakash would recognize this as a token of submission, so that the people of Burgundy might escape the fate of their kinsmen. The custom, said Goru, had been borrowed from the cannibals, who in old times worshipped the Aakash and offered a human sacrifice at each moon. But chance had showed them that the Aakash could be killed, so they ceased to worship them. At least that was Goru's deduction, and he explained at much length that no mortal thing is worthy of real adoration, however evil or powerful it may be. His own ancestors had made occasional sacrifices to placate the winged devils, but until lately it had not been a regular custom. Now it was necessary. The Aakash expected it, and each moon they chose from their waning numbers a strong young man or a girl who they bound to the stake. Kane watched Goru's face closely as he spoke of his sorrow for this unspeakable necessity. And the Englishman realized that the priest was sincere. Kane shuddered at the thought of a tribe of human beings thus passing slowly but surely into the maws of a race of monsters. Kane spoke of the wretch he had seen, and Goru nodded, pain in his soft eyes. For a day and a night he had been hanging there, while the Akanas glutted their vile torture lust on his quivering, agonized flesh. Thus far, the sacrifices had kept doom from the village. The remaining pigs furnished sustenance for the dwindling Akanas, together with an occasional baby snatched up. And they were content to have their nameless sport with the single victim each moon. A thought came to Kane.
The cannibals, they never come up into the plateau.
Goro shook his head. Safe in their jungle, they never raided past the savannas.
But they hunted me to the very foot of the hills.
Again, Goro shook his head. There was only one cannibal. They had found his footprints. Evidently, a single warrior, bolder than the rest, had allowed his passion for the chase to overcome his fear of the grisly plateau, and had paid the penalty. Ah! Kane's teeth came together with a vicious snap, which ordinarily took the place of profanity with him. He was stung by the thought of fleeing so long from a single enemy. No wonder that enemy had followed so cautiously, waiting until dark to attack. But, asked Kane, why had the Akana seized the cannibal instead of himself? And why had he not been attacked by the Batman, who alighted in his tree that night? The cannibal was bleeding, Goro answered. The scent called the bat fiend to attack, for they scented raw blood as far as vultures. And they were very wary. They had never seen a man like Kane, who showed no fear. Surely they had decided to spy on him, take him off guard before they struck. Who were these creatures? Kane asked. Goro shrugged his shoulders. They were there when his ancestors came, who had never heard of them before he saw them. There was no intercourse with the cannibals, so they could learn nothing from them. The Akana lived in caves, naked like beasts. They knew nothing of fire and ate only fresh, raw meat. But they had had a language of a sort and acknowledged a king among them. Many died in the Great Famine, when the stronger ate the weaker. They were vanishing swiftly. Of late years, no females or young had been observed among them. When these males died at last, there would be no more Akanas. But Bagonda, observed Goro, was doomed already, unless... He looked strangely and wistfully at Kane. But the Puritan was deep in thought. Among the swarm of native legends he had heard on his wanderings, one now stood out. Long, long ago, an old juju man had told him winged devils came flying out of the north and passed over his country, vanishing in the maze of the jungle-haunted south. And the juju man related an old legend concerning these creatures. That once they had abode in myriad numbers far on a great lake, of bitter waters many moons to the north. And ages ago, a chieftain and his warriors fought them with bows and arrows and slew many, driving the rest into the south. The name of the chief was Nyasuna, and he owned a great war canoe with many oars driving it swiftly through the bitter water. And now, a cold wind blew suddenly on Solomon Kane, as if from a door opened suddenly on outer gulfs of time and space. For now he realized the truth of that garbled myth, and the truth of an older, grimmer legend. For what was the great bitter lake but the Mediterranean Ocean? And who was the chief Nyasuna but the hero Jason, who conquered the Harpies and drove them, not alone into the Strophades Isles, but into Africa as well? The old pagan tale was true then, Kane thought dizzily, shrinking aghast from the strange realm of grisly possibilities this opened up. For if this myth of the harpies were a reality, what of the other legends? The Hydra, the Centaurs, the Chimera, Medusa, Pan, and the Satyrs? All those myths of antiquity. Behind them did there lie and lurk nightmare realities with slavering fangs, and talons steeped in shuddersome evil. Africa, the dark continent, land of shadows and horror, of bewitchment and sorcery, into which all evil things had been banished before the growing light of the Western world. Kane came out of his reveries with a start. Goru was tugging gently and timidly at his sleeve.
Save us from the Aakash, said Goru. If you not be a god, there is the power of God in you. You bear in your hand the mighty Juju stave, which in times gone by been the scepter of fallen empires, and the staff of mighty priests, and you have weapons which speak death in fire and smoke. For our young men watched and saw you slay 2 Aakash. We would make you king, god, what you will. More than a moon has passed since you came into Bagonda, and the time for the sacrifice is gone by. But the bloody stake stands bare. The Aakash shun the village where you lie. They steal no more babes from us. We have thrown off their yoke, because our trust is in you.
Kane clasped his temples with his hands.
You know not what you ask,
he cried.
God knoweth, it is in my deepest heart to rid the land of this evil. But I am no god. With my pistols I can slay a few of the fiends, but I have but little powder left. Had I a great store of powder and ball, and the musket I shattered in the vampire hills of the dead, then indeed there would be a rare hunting. But even if I slew all those fiends, what of the cannibals? They too will fear you,
cried old Koroba, while the girl Nylea and the lad Loga, who was to have been the next sacrifice, gazed at his wife, their souls in their eyes. Kane dropped his chin on his fist and sighed.
Yet I will stay, here in Bagonda, all the rest of my life, if ye thinks I be protection to the people.
So Solomon Kane stayed at the village of Bagonda of the Shadow. The people were a kindly folk, whose natural sprightliness and fun-loving spirits were subdued and saddened by long dwelling in the shadow. But now they had taken new heart by the Englishman's coming, and it wrenched Kane's heart to note the pathetic trust they placed in him. Now they sang in the plantain fields, and danced about the fire, and gazed at him with adoring faith in their eyes. But Kane, crushed by his own helplessness, knew how futile would be his fancied protection if the winged fiends swept suddenly out of the skies. But he stayed in Bagonda. In his dreams, the gulls wheeled above the cliffs of old Devon, carved in the clean, blue, wind-whipped skies. And in the day, the call of the unknown lands beyond Bagonda clawed at his heart with fierce yearning. But he abode in Bagonda and racked his brains for a plan. He sat and gazed for hours at the juju stave, hoping in desperation that black magic would aid him where his mind failed. But Nolonga's ancient gift gave him no aid. Once he had summoned the Slave Coast shaman to him across leagues of intervening space. But it was only when confronted with supernatural manifestations that Nolonga could come to him. And these harpies were not supernatural. The germ of an idea began to grow at the back of Kane's mind, but he discarded it. It had to do with a great trap, and how could the Aakash be trapped? The roaring of lions played a grim accompaniment to his brooding meditations. As man dwindled on the plateau, the hunting beasts who feared only the spears of the hunters were beginning to gather. Kane laughed bitterly. It was not lions that might be hunted down and slain singly that he had to deal with. And some distance from the village stood the great hut of Goru. Once a council hall, this hut was full of many strange fetishes, which Goru said with a helpless wave of his fat hands, were strong magic against evil spirits, but scant protection against winged hellions of gristle and bone and flesh. Chapter 4. The Madness of Solomon. Kane woke suddenly from a dreamless sleep. A hideous medley of screams burst horrific in his ears. Outside his hut, people were dying in the night, horribly, as cattle die in the shambles. He had slept, as always, with his weapons buckled on him. Now he bounded to the door, and something fell mouthing and slavering at his feet, to grasp his knees in a convulsive grin and gibber incoherent pleas. In the faint light of a smouldering fire nearby, Kane in horror recognized the face of the youth Logga, now frightfully torn and drenched in blood, already freezing into a death mask. The night was full of fearful sounds, inhuman howling mingled with the whisper of mighty wings, the tearing of thatch and a ghastly demon laughter. Kane freed himself from the locked, dead arms and sprang to the dying fire. He could make out only a confused and vague maze of fleeing forms and darting shapes, the shift and blur of dark wings against the stars. He snatched up a brand and thrust it against the thatch of his hut, and as the flame leaped up and showed him the scene, he stood frozen and aghast. Red, howling doom had fallen on Bagonda. Winged monsters raced screaming through our streets, wheeled above the heads of the fleeing people, or tore apart the hut thatches to get at the gibbering victims within. With a choked cry, the Englishman woke from his trance of horror, drew and fired at a darting, flame-eyed shadow, which fell at his feet with a shattered skull, and Kane gave tongue to one deep, fierce roar and bounded into the melee, all the berserk fury of his heathen Saxon ancestors bursting into terrible being. Dazed and bewildered by the sudden attack, cowed by long years of submission, the Burgundy were incapable of combined resistance, and for the most part, died like sheep. Some, maddened by desperation, fought back, but their arrows went wild or glanced from the tough wings, while the devilish agility of the creatures made spear thrust and axe stroke uncertain. Leaping from the ground, they avoided the blows of their victims, and, sweeping down upon their shoulders, dashed them to the earth where fang and talon did their crimson work. Kane saw old Koroba, gaunt and bloodstained, at bay against a hut wall, with his foot on the neck of a monster who had not been quick enough. The grim-faced old chief wielded a two-handed axe in great, sweeping blows that for the moment held back the screeching onset of half a dozen of the devils. Kane was leaping to his aid when a low, pitiful whimper checked him. The girl Nayela writhed weakly, prone in the bloody dust, while on her back a vulture-like thing crouched and tore. Her dulling eyes sought the face of the Englishman in an anguished appeal. Kane ripped out a bitter oath and fired point blank. Damn you! The winged devil pitched backward with an abhorrent screeching and a wild flutter of dying wings. And Kane bent to the dying girl. She whimpered and kissed his hands with uncertain lips as he cradled her head in his arms, her eyes set. Kane laid the body gently down, looking for Koroba. He saw only a huddled cluster of grisly shapes that sucked and tore at something between them, and Kane went mad. With a scream that cut through the inferno, he bounded up, slaying even as he rose. Even in the act of lunging up from bent knee, he drew and thrust, transfixing a vulture-like throat, then whipping out his rapier as the thing floundered and twitched in its death struggle. The raging Puritan charged forward, seeking new victims. On all sides of him, the people of Baganda were dying hideously. They fought futilely, or they fled, and the demons coursed them down, as a hawk courses a hare. They ran into the huts, and the fiends rent the thatch or burst the door. And what took place in those huts was mercifully hidden from Kane's eyes. And to the frantic Puritan's horror-distorted brain, it seemed that he alone was responsible. The Burgundy had trusted him to save them. They had withheld the sacrifice and defied their grim masters. Now they were paying the horrible penalty, and he was unable to save them. In the agony-dimmed eyes turned toward him, Kane quaffed the black dregs of the bitter cup. It was riot anger, or the vindictiveness of fear. It was hurt and a stunned reproach. He was their god, and he had failed them. Now he ravened through the massacre, and the fiends avoided him, turning to the easy victims. But Kane was not to be denied. In a red haze that was not of the burning hut, he saw a culminating horror. A harpy gripped a writhing, naked thing that had been a woman, and the wolfish fangs gorged deep. As Kane sprang, thrusting, the Batman dropped his yammering, mowing prey and soared aloft. But Kane dropped his rapier, and with the bound of a blood-mad panther, caught the demon's throat and locked his iron legs about its lower body. Once again, he found himself battling in mid-air, but this time close above the hut roofs. Terror had entered the cold brain of the harpy. He did not fight to hold and slay. He wished only to be rid of this silent, clinging thing that stabbed so savagely for his life. He floundered wildly, screaming abhorrently, and thrashing with his wings. Then Kane's dirk bit deeper, dipped suddenly sideways, and fell headlong. The thatch of a hut broke their fall, and Kane and the dying harpy crashed through to land on a writhing mass on the hut floor. In the lurid flickering of the burning hut outside that vaguely lighted the hut into which they had fallen, Kane saw a deed of brain-shaking horror being enacted. Red dripping fangs in a yawning gash of a mouth, and a crimson travesty of a human form that still writhed with agonized life. Then, in the maze of madness that held him, his steel fingers closed on the fiend's throat, in a grip that no tearing of talons or hammering of wings could loosen, until he felt the horrid life flow out from under his fingers, and the bony neck hung broken. Outside, the red madness of slaughter continued. Kane bounded up, his hand closing blindly on the haft of some weapon, and as he leapt from the hut, a harpy soared from under his very feet. It was an axe that Kane had snatched up, and he dealt a stroke that spattered the demon's brains like water. He sprang forward, stumbling over bodies and parts of bodies, blood streaming from a dozen wounds. And then he halted, baffled and screaming with rage. The Bat People were taken to the air. No longer would they face this strange madman, who in his insanity was more terrible than they. But they went not alone into the upper regions. In their lustful talons they bore writhing, screaming forms, and Kane, raging to and fro with his dripping axe, found himself alone in a corpse-choked village. He drew back his head, to shriek his hate at the fiends above him, and he felt warm, thick drops fall into his face, while the shadowy skies were filled with screams of agony and the laughter of monsters. As the sounds of that ghastly feast in the skies filled the night, and the blood that rained from the stars fell into Kane's face, Kane's last vestige of reason snapped. He gibbered to and fro, screaming chaotic blasphemies. And was he not a symbol of man? Staggering among the tooth-marked bones and severed, grinning heads of humans, brandishing a futile axe, and screaming incoherent hate at the grisly, winged shapes of night that make him their prey, chuckling in demonic triumph above him, and dripping into his mad eyes the pitiful blood of their human victims.
Chapter 5. The Conqueror. A shuddering, white-faced dawn crept over the black hills to shiver above the red shambles that had been the village of Bagonda. The hut stood intact, except for the one which had sunk to smouldering coals. But the thatches of many were torn, dismembered bones, half or wholly stripped of flesh, lay in the streets, and some were splintered as though they had been dropped from a great height. It was a realm of the dead, where was but one sign of life. Solomon Kane leaned on his blood-clotted axe and gazed upon the scene with dull, mad eyes. He was grimed and clotted with half-dried blood from long gashes on chest, face, and shoulders, but he paid no heed to his hurts. The people of Bagonda had not died alone. 17 harpies lay among the bones. 6 of these Kane had slain. The rest had fallen before the frantic, dying desperation of the Burgundy, but it was poor toll to take in return. Of the 400-odd people of Upper Bagonda, not one had lived to see the dawn. And the harpies were gone, back to their caves in the Black Hills, gorged to repletion. With slow, mechanical steps, Kane went about gathering up his weapons. He found his sword, dirk, pistols, and the juju stave. He left the main village and went up the slope to the great hut of Goru, and there he halted, stung by a new horror. The ghastly humour of the harpies had prompted a delicious jest. Above the hut door stared the severed head of Goru. The fat cheeks were sunken, the lips lolled in an aspect of horrified idiocy, and the eyes stared like a hurt child. And in those eyes, Kane saw wonder and reproach. Kane looked at the shambles that had been Bagonda, and he looked at the death mask of Goru, and he lifted his clenched fists above his head, and with glaring eyes raised and writhing lips flecked with froth, he cursed the sky and the earth and the spheres above and below. He cursed the cold stars, the blazing sun, the mocking moon and the whisper of the wind. He cursed all fates and destinies, all that he had loved or hated. The silent cities beneath the seas, the past ages and the future eons. In one soul-shaking burst of blasphemy, he cursed the gods and devils who make mankind their sport. And he cursed man, who lives blindly on and blindly offers his back to the iron-hoofed feet of his gods. Then as breath failed, he halted, panting. From the lower reaches sounded the deep roaring of a lion, and into the eyes of Solomon Kane came a crafty gleam. He stood along, as one frozen, and out of his madness grew a desperate plan. And he silently recanted his blasphemy,
For if the brazen-hoofed gods made man for their sport and plaything, they also gave him a brain that holds craft and cruelty greater than any other living thing.
There you shall bide, said Solomon Kane to the head of Goru. The sun will wither you, and the cold dews of night will shrivel you. But I will keep the kites from you, and your eyes shall see the fall of your slayers. I could not save the people of Baganda, but by the god of my race, I can avenge them. Man is the sport and sustenance of titanic beings of night and horror, whose giant wings hover ever above him. But even evil things may come to an end. And watch ye, Goru.
In the days that followed, Kane laboured mightily, beginning with the first grey light of dawn and toiling on past sunset, into the white moonlight till he fell and slept the sleep of utter exhaustion. He snatched food as he worked, and he gave his wounds absolutely no heed, scarcely being aware that they healed of themselves. He went down to the lower levels and cut bamboo, great sacks of long, tough stalks. He cut thick branches of trees and tough vines to serve as ropes. With this material, he reinforced the walls and roof of Goru's hut. He set the bamboos deep in the earth, hard against the wall, and interwove and twined them, binding them fast with the vines that were pliant and tough as cords. The long branches he made fast along the thatch, binding them close together. When he had finished, an elephant could scarcely have burst through the walls. The lions had come to the plateau in great numbers, and the herds of little pigs dwindled fast. Those the lions spared, Kane slew, and tossed to the jackals. This racked Kane's heart, for he was a kindly man, and this wholesale slaughter, even of pigs, who would fall prey to hunting beasts anyhow, grieved him. But it was part of his plan of vengeance, and he steeled his heart. The days stretched into weeks, Kane told by day and by night, and between his stints he talked to the shriveled, mummied head of Goru, whose eyes, strangely enough, did not change in the blaze of the sun or the haunt of the moon, but retained their lifelike expression. When the memory of those lunacy-haunted days had become only a vague nightmare, Kane wondered if, as it had seemed to him, Goru's dried lips had moved in answer, speaking strange and mysterious things. Kane saw the Aakash, wheeling against the sky at a distance, but they did not come near. Even when he slept in the great hut, pistols at hand. They feared his power to deal death with smoke and thunder. At first he noted that they flew sluggishly, gorged with the flesh they had eaten on that red night, and the bodies they had borne to their caves. But as the weeks passed, they appeared leaner, and ranged far afield in search of food, and Kane laughed, deeply and madly. This plan of his would never have worked before, but now there were no humans to fill the bellies of the harpy folk, and there were no more pigs. In all the plateau, there were no creatures for the Bat people to eat. Why they did not range east of the hills, Kane thought he knew. That must be a region of thick jungle, like the country to the west. He saw them fly into the grasslands for antelope, and he saw the lions take toll of them. After all, the Aakash were weak beings among the hunters, strong enough only to slay pigs and deer and humans. At last they began to soar close to him at night, and he saw their greedy eyes glaring at him through the gloom. He judged the time was ripe. Huge buffaloes, too big and ferocious for the Bat people to slay, had strayed up into the plateau to ravage the deserted fields of the dead Gandhi. Kane got one of these out of the herd and drove him, with shouts and volleys of stones, to the hut of Goru. It was a tedious, dangerous task, and time and again Kane barely escaped the surly bull's sudden charges. but persevered and at last shot the beast before the hut. A strong west wind was blowing, and Kane flung handfuls of blood into the air for the scent to waft to the harpies in the hills. He cut the bull to pieces and carried its quarters into the hut, and then managed to drag the huge trunk itself inside. Then he retired to the thick trees nearby and waited. He had not long to wait. The morning air filled suddenly with the beat of many wings, and a hideous flock alighted before the hut of Goru. All of the beasts, or men, seemed to be there, and Kane gazed in wonder at the tall, strange creatures, so like to humanity and yet so unlike, the veritable demons of priestly legend. They folded their wings like cloaks about them as they walked upright, and they talked to one another in a strident, crackling voice that had nothing of the human in it. No, Kane decided, these things were not men. They were the materialization of some ghastly jest of nature, some travesty of the world's infancy when creation was an experiment. Perhaps they were the offspring of a forbidden and obscene mating of man and beast. More likely they were a freakish offshoot on the branch of evolution. For Kane had long ago dimly sensed the truth in the heretical theories of the ancient philosophers, that man is but a higher beast. And if nature made many strange beasts in the past ages, why should she not have experimented with monstrous forms of mankind? Surely man, as Kane knew him, was not the first of his breed to walk on earth, nor yet to be the last. Now the harpies hesitated, with their natural distrust for a building, and some soared to the roof and toward the thatch. But Kane had built it well. They returned to the earth, and at last, driven beyond endurance by the smell of raw blood and the sight of the flesh within, one of them ventured inside. In an instant, all were crowded into the great hut, tearing ravenously at the meat. And when the last one was within, Kane reached out a hand and jerked a long vine, which tripped the catch that held the door he had built. It fell with a crash, and the bar he had fashioned dropped into place. That door would hold against the charge of a wild bull. Kane came from his cover and scanned the sky. Some 140 harpies had entered the hut. He saw no more winging through the skies and believed it safe to suppose he had the whole flock trapped. Then with a cruel, brooding smile, Kane struck flint and steel to a pile of dead leaves next to the wall. Within sounded an uneasy mumbling as the creatures realized they were prisoners. A thin wisp of smoke curled upwards, and a flicker of red followed it. The whole heap burst into flame, and the dry bamboo caught. A few moments later, the whole side of the wall was ablaze. The fiends inside scented the smoke and grew restless. Kane heard them cackling wildly and clawing at the walls. He grinned savagely, bleakly, and without mirth. Now a veer of wind drove the flames around the wall and up over the thatch. With a roar, the whole hut caught and leapt into flame. From within sounded a fearful pandemonium. Kane heard bodies crash against the walls, which shook to the impact, but held. The horrid screams were music to his soul, and brandishing his arms, he answered them with screams of fearful, soul-shaking laughter. The cataclysm of horror rose unbearably, paling the tumult of the flames. Then it dwindled to a medley of strange gibbering and gasps as the flames ate in and the smoke thickened. An intolerable scent of burning flesh pervaded the atmosphere, and had there been room in Kane's brain for aught else than insane triumph, he would have shuddered to realize that the scent was of that nauseating and indescribable odor that only human flesh emits when burning. From the thick cloud of smoke, Kane saw a mowing, gibbering thing emerge through the shredding roof and flap slowly and agonizingly upward on fearful burned wings. Calmly he aimed and fired, and the scorched and blinded thing tumbled back into the flaming mass just as the walls crashed in. To Kane it seemed that Goru's crumbling face, vanishing in the smoke, split suddenly in a wide grin, and a sudden shout of exultant human laughter mingled eerily in the roar of the flames. But the smoke, an insane brain, plays queer tricks. Kane stood, with the juju stave in one hand and the smoking pistol in the other, above the smouldering ruins that hid forever from the sight of man the last of those terrible semi-human monsters, whom another hero had banished from Europe in an unknown age. Kane stood, an unconscious statue of triumph. The ancient empires fall, the dark-skinned people fade, and even the demons of antiquity gasp their last. But over all stands the Aryan barbarian, white-skinned, cold-eyed, dominant, the supreme fighting man of the earth, whether he be clad in wolf hide and horned helm, or boots and doublet, whether he bear in his hand battle-axe or rapier, whether he be called Dorian, Saxon, or Englishman, whether his name is Jason, Hengist, or Solomon Kane. Smoke curled upward into the morning sky, and the roaring foraging of lions shook the plateau. Slowly, like light breaking through mists, sanity returned to him.
The light of God's morning enters even into dark and loathsome lands, said Kane somberly. Evil rules in the wastelands of the earth. But even evil may come to an end. Dawn follows midnight, and even in the lost land, the shadows shrink. Stranger thy ways, O God of my people, and who am I to question thy wisdom? My feet have fallen in evil ways, but thou hast brought me forth, scatheless, and hast made me a scourge of the powers of evil. Over the souls of men spread the condor wings of colossal monsters, and all manner of evil things prey upon the heart and soul and body of man. Yet it may be in some far day the shadows shall fade, and the Prince of Darkness be chained forever in his hell. Until then, mankind can but stand up stoutly to the monsters, in his own heart and without, and with the aid of God, he may yet triumph.
And Solomon Kane looked up into the silent hills, and felt the silent call of the hills and the unguessed distances beyond. And Solomon Kane shifted his belt, took his staff firmly in his hand, and turned his face eastward. Thank you for listening. This has been a Cybrarian production of Robert E. Howard's Solomon Kane, Wings in the Night. For updates, follow Vane Studios on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Images courtesy of Unsplash.com. Audio samples courtesy of YouTube Audio Library. Please like, comment, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell of the Cybrarian YouTube channel. And if you're feeling generous, buy us a coffee to support our work. All links in the description.